Today, U.S. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. We know what happened. It's a rather strange anniversary because typically people do one that ends in a 5 or a 0. But notably, this is also the day the UN Security Council Resolution 242 was adopted and established a set of principles aimed at guiding negotiations for an Arab and Israeli peace settlement. Now, what is, I guess, most telling about this as time has passed and as I've kind of gone back and looked at material from back then and just things that have happened since, I would argue JFK's death is probably the most impactful of any human being in the past 7 or 8 decades, or possibly just of the 20th century and since. Because if you look at everything afterward, it's almost, it wouldn't have happened potentially if he hadn't have just gone out. So, for example, if he doesn't get murdered, we likely don't get the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. We don't get any of the domestic programs that his successor, President Johnson, who had more experience with negotiations after having served in both chambers of Congress. Similarly to Kennedy, but he wasn't as renowned for just being able to compromise and negotiate with those of various beliefs. And if we don't get Johnson, we also potentially don't get Vietnam, which was the main issue that Nixon was able to ride on in terms of his challenge to the Democrats in 1968. If we don't get Nixon, we definitely don't get Ford, who was only appointed, or rather succeeded Nixon after Watergate. And if we don't get Ford, we potentially don't get Carter, who was able to capitalize on the distrust that people had toward Washington in the aftermath of both Nixon and Ford's administrations. If we don't get Carter, we potentially don't get Reagan, who was able to challenge Carter on inflation, the Iran hostage crisis. If we don't get Reagan, we possibly don't get the older Bush, who we rode on Reagan's success while in office, or just popularity, depending on which way you want to see it. If we don't get the older Bush, we likely don't get the younger one, who had name recognition going off his father when he challenged Ann Richards in the 1994 Texas gubernatorial race. And we likely don't get President Clinton, or Clinton rather, or Bill, if we really don't know which one I'm referring to, who was able to use the older Bush's breaking of his promise for increasing taxes against him in the 1992 presidential election. Now, if we don't get the younger Bush, who doesn't have the name recognition that allowed him to win from the Texas race for the governorship, based off his father not being president in this hypothetical timeline, then we possibly don't get Obama, who was able to ride off of the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, as well as the Iraq War, as well as the Afghan War. It's just, and if we don't get Obama, we potentially don't get Trump, which I'm sure a lot of people would prefer that, but it still lingers 5 or so decades later. And that's something people don't seem to get. My opinion of JFK is a little bit different from a lot of the individuals you might see talking about this today on social media. I have really become more and more neutral to him as time has passed, and that's based off the idea that probably out of all of these presidents that died in office, his death is mainly the crux of what his legacy should be, because it shows the ramifications that have resulted from one person who held that office for a couple of years not being able to live out their term. I mean, we're talking global influence. Even if you say that domestic policies likely wouldn't have happened, we don't have LBJ's Voting Rights Act. We don't have Nixon's war on drugs. We don't have any of these programs, because none of these people served, because what they used to become one of his successors wasn't possible due to his death, not having put the person who they were trying to replace in that position. Um, so take that away, and I would say that's the main thing to think about. Just one person dying just completely morphed the world in a way that I don't think anyone else has been able to do since, and most people will probably never be able to do. And that's a rather dubious honor, because who wants to be known for, oh, my death just flipped everything around? It's not the ideal situation, but it is what is remembered in part in within the assassination and its following anniversaries.